Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Next thing you know the next thing. Next is Now is a short podcast discussing agriculture's emerging next-gen tech and trends as they're happening in our industry. Next is Now, presented by GFL Ag. Listen where you get your podcasts today.
Shaun Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and RealAg Radio on Roll Radio 147. And we are talking right now to Jay Whetter. He is the editor of Canola Digest magazine with the Canola Council of Canada. Hey, Jay, how's it going?
Hey, Shaun, great. I'm on the streets of San Francisco right now. I've never done.
This is great. This is like live in the moment as Jay walks. As you walk the streets of San Francisco, make sure it can be dangerous at times, so be careful out there.
No, I'm trying to stay on a quiet street. Otherwise, it's nuts here. If you've ever been, it's a pretty busy place, and so I'm just walking up and down this side street where there isn't much traffic. There's not as many people, so it's a little bit quieter, so I can hear what you're saying.
Good stuff. Okay, Jay. Now you're at a pretty significant event this week around the whole idea of agricultural technology. What event is it? And talk about it a little bit.
It's the World Agri-Tech Innovation Summit. And my old friend Scott Day told me a few years ago that I should come down to this. And so I looked into it a little bit, and it's $2,000 US, the early bird rate, for a 2-day conference, so it was Tuesday, Wednesday this week. And that's beyond the budget of most of the organizations out there, including the Canola Council. But I got a media pass for free. So there you go. I was able to attend.
Winner.
And then I'm staying on Scott's couch. So it's I'm a real cheap date here. But it was pretty amazing. And, you know, it's agriculture, people. But I learned something really, really interesting if you want to get right into it. But one of the presentations was with Vinod Khosla, who's a big venture capital investor. And he's invested in Blue River, which was bought up by John Deere. He invested in Possible Burger. He invested in Climate Corp before it was bought up by Monsanto and now part of the Bayer system. Anyway, he said something really interesting that stuck with me. He said that the most significant innovations will not come from experts within an industry. And he wasn't talking about agriculture specifically, but I thought, okay, yeah, we spend so much time talking to ourselves. I barely talk to people outside of canola, let alone people in beef or cereals.
Yeah.
I mean, I do. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but for any of the big breakthroughs in agriculture, we need to make sure that we're creating opportunities for people outside of agriculture to spend some money and give us some guidance. And of course, there's going to be incremental improvements, from within. I mean, we'll talk to ourselves and make small improvements here and there, but for really revolutionary change, the kinds of things that Vinod Khosla wants to invest in, it's going to come from outside agriculture. I think there's a good message for us in that.
I hear you. I agree. That's a really, really good thought. Jay, I'm interested. What's kind of the mood there with people, stakeholders that are living and breathing agricultural technology and innovation? Because, we're at a time where we're kind of, commodity prices have slipped and the mood is sort of changed in the U.S. and in Canada. So what was kind of the sentiment and the outlook of delegates that were in attendance?
Well, having not been there before, it was hard for me to say, oh, this is way, like the vibe is down from other years. But again, my friend Scott Day, I grew up with Scott. He and I grew up 2 miles apart. And Scott is living in this world now. It's kind of he lives like a fantasy world, but he's an advisor, I guess you could say, on staff though with Fall Line Capital, which is a venture capital company based out of this area, like Silicon Valley, basically. So Scott's been coming to this thing for 10, 12 years now. And he said the real numbers in terms of venture capital investment in agriculture are half what they were last year. Now, so there is a strong correlation between commodity prices and the economics at the farm level and also at the venture capital level. So it's interesting that parallel is happening. And granted, last year was a big year. Like, so are we? I asked him, are we? Was last year different in that it was so large? And he said, yeah. So it was a big year last year, and this year's about half in terms of raising money. And he said they're not funding fewer projects. Like the same number of projects are getting funded, but basically on average half the amount of money. Mm. So there's a lot of people with ideas that are having trouble getting the money they want or they need to push their idea toward. There's a lot of steps between an idea and commercial reality, but just making those steps toward commercial, they're not getting the money they want. So were there a lot of really hungry people at the event? Maybe, yeah. But the big topics, like biologicals were. I think last year I attended virtually, and biologicals were such a big part of the conversation, and I got the sense that that had dropped off pretty significantly, and I asked Scott if that was whether I was imagining things or whether that was real. And he said, no, that's real. Like we're waiting on something to prove that it works. And so far we're kind of dancing around the edges of a real breakthrough. And there's nothing really significant happening in that space. So
what's this year's big, because we see these things ebb and flow, and there's always like really, really, the sexy things of the year in terms of where the money flows to. Is there one this year that feels like it's getting a little bit more attention?
The one thing that kept popping up for me was measuring of emissions, which I really like that. And again, am I hearing that because I want to hear it? Because Shaun, there's just so many ideas flowing around in this space at that conference. It's almost exhausting to the brain. You go to an amazing conference, at the end of it, you're like, what just happened? Like, what? What did I learn? What am I going to take away from that? So I'm feeling probably a little bit overwhelmed, and I got a notebook full of stuff that I need to go through. But yeah, these tools to measure actual emissions, to measure what carbon is being sequestered, and so they're like soil probes, that kind of thing, or even maybe some. I'm not sure there's satellites necessarily, but there are these towers that have these sensors on them that can actually follow the nitrogen and the carbon that's gassing off of a field. It's pretty impressive. But to me, that was what was happening, so that we can get away from these model-based approaches. So, country by country or maybe province by province, saying this is what's happening in this province based on the models. But what that means then is if a farmer takes on steps to reduce emission, that farmer is not being recognized in the models. So if we want to incentivize farmers to take steps to reduce their emissions, we do need a real precise way to measure what's happening in each field and certainly on each farm. And so that was a big theme that I pulled out of the event. The problem there, Shaun, is that we still don't have a good system to pay farmers for that work. So we talk a lot about emissions. We need a way to measure emissions, and then we need a way to pay farmers for that. So I feel like we're still in early days in all of this, and maybe that's why the model-based system is how to get started. But I just don't see the model-based system as a really good long-term solution.
Yeah, so there's a difference between paying for practices versus paying for outcomes, right?
Yeah. No, that came up too, Shaun, is that I just want to know that you're reducing emissions. I don't care how you're doing it. And I'm so glad you asked that, because it wasn't something I jotted down in my notes, but it was something that I had my notes to talk with you about, but they're in my bigger notes. But this notion of outputs versus practices, exactly right. we talk about best management practices in canola world. Like when I do my agronomy conversations with farmers, Canola Watch, Canola Digest, etc., it's all about best management practices. But ultimately, people don't care how you're getting there, really, as long as we're seeing the results. And that result will be lower emissions. It might be biodiversity eventually. That'll be another conversation that we have. So let's measure the results. And then however you get there, great.
Yeah. So, Jay, there's no shortage of discussions about sustainability and emissions, but how about in the area of productivity and operational efficiency? Was there much discussion there at the summit this year about that?
Well, yeah, I had a bit of a side conversation, and I'm not going to say the company because I think the guy wasn't really wanting me to broadcast it to the world development right now. But yeah, this, you know how, well, I'm a big fan of variable rate fertilizer, and we'll get to seed and pesticide application eventually. But I can see there's real practical shortcomings there in that we can use historic maps to get better at the right rates and the right locations. But as this technology evolves, I think we'll get to it just in time. And this is what this company is working on, is an actual nutrient sensor. I think they're just doing nitrogen to start with because that's the big one. But it's almost like the OptiSpray. So it can do a quick test of what's the nitrogen levels in the soil, and then adjust the rate on the fly. And I think that's really compelling because then it's assessing the exact situation in the field at that moment, and it's not relying on historical maps. And again, I think that's a long way. I mean, we need the technology to be able to do that, but it also has to do it in about half of a second.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't want to be seeding it a quarter of a mile an hour. So, yeah. So there's a lot of things that need to happen before we get to that stage. But that is a conversation that we had on the productivity side. Was there anything else more on that? There's one other thing I wanted to mention, if I can. Yeah. It's totally gears though.
Go ahead.
So I sat around a table with. It's interesting setup for this one section that they had on the agenda where there were 30 tables, and at each table was an expert. And on the big screen, it showed who, like table 30 had so-and-so person. And then you can just decide whatever table you want to sit at. And I chose a table with a guy from Kraft Heinz. And his job was to procure the tomato paste for ketchup. Obviously a big job for Heinz. And I asked him, if one farmer is achieving X carbon intensity per ton of paste, and another farmer has a worse carbon intensity, like a higher score, how do you pay, or what's the reward to the farmer who has the lower carbon intensity? And he said, more business. So I said, okay, so you're not going to pay them more, but they long-term will keep the business. Whereas the other farmer who doesn't have the lower carbon intensity score will eventually lose the business or be forced to match that carbon intensity eventually. So, we want farmers to get paid for these practices. But after listening to this guy with Heinz, I get the sense that the payment will be in being able to sell your product. So the premium, even if they're short term, the conversation was often that the premium was just to get the process going. Ultimately, the premium will disappear.
But that's similar to, like, you think about you're making a product, you're going to get it on the store shelf, and you need to do certain things in order to get access to that store shelf, right? And so really it becomes those practices or that lower carbon intensity score that's the pathway to the access to do the business with that. It's that's going to be troubling for some. That there's
it sounds pretty cutthroat. Doesn't sound very appealing, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I mean, if that's what Kraft Heinz is saying, I think that's probably how it's going to go. I think we just need to be prepared for that possibility.
Good. That's a important point there. You buried the lead there, Jay.
Yeah, I got there eventually.
Hey, Jay, thanks so much for joining us from the streets of San Francisco. Too bad the Giants aren't in town. You're there a little bit too early, but you enjoy yourself and safe travels home, okay?
Thanks, Shaun. Ray. Good. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the event. Talk to you later.